Hello and welcome to another episode to learn Python for absolute beginners. Today we're going to talk about functions. A function is basically a piece of code that you create and you can wrap it around a name like a label, and you can reuse it as many times as you want in your code, and it's going to save you a lot of time. There are tons of functions and we already use several of them, but here we're going to learn how to define, how to create our own. Think about a function as a black box. Basically, you pass some data to the function. Maybe you don't even need to pass any data. You just call the function does something internally and then returns data. This could be something that it returns, or it also can be something that the function performs. Let's take a look at this in the whiteboard. This function, which is this kind of sort of black box, you pass data from one side and it returns data on the other side. So here you have your own code that you saw already we wrote before. So the parameters that you pass here are what we see inside the parentheses of a function. And whatever returns here is what we can use from the function. Many times we don't really need to pass a parameter, but sometimes we do. It doesn't really matter. It depends on what kind of magic is happening inside this black box. We already used several functions before. For example, print. This is a function as well, because as you can see, it has a name and then it has the two parentheses, one opening and the other one closing. And between these parentheses is where we pass the information for that function. In case of print, we pass actually a string or a number, anything we wanted to print. For example, here we are passing a string. The way it works is that the print function inside of this black box, basically it has some code that will have the mechanics to actually print something on the screen. So what we are passing here as an argument is the string hello world. And as an output, it's just basically going to perform an action. It's not returning a value. What it does is printing something on the screen. How do we define our own functions? We use a keyword called def. And then here we put the name of the function, then a parenthesis, the parameters we want to pass to the function, close the parenthesis, a column, and here we write the statements, basically the code that function is going to perform. Remember that here we have the indentation that requires, because this part here, which is indented, is a block of code that is not always going to be executed. It depends if we call or not this function, and this is part of this function and this function alone. These parameters here that we pass to the function can be used along the code somewhere as we need it. So it's parameters that become variables that the function will be able to use internally to perform some actions. Let's take a look at this in the code. Here I defined a simple function called myFunction. And this function, what it does is simply printing this on the screen. This is myFunction. If we run this, we don't see anything on the screen. And the reason is because we just defined this function, but we didn't call it. So the action, which is calling a function, we just type the name of the function, myFunction. And in this case, there are no parameters. As you can see, between the two parentheses, there are no parameters for this function, so we don't need to pass any here. And now that we already calling the function by its name, when we run it, whatever is inside the function, these statements here are going to be executed. And you can see here, this is myFunction. This is a very powerful concept because, as you can see here, basically this myFunction, what it does is enclosing a piece of code, any complexity, any big we want, in a name, the name of the function. So we can pass parameters, meaning that a piece of code can work in different scenarios for different values, and we can reuse it anywhere in the code. That is an extremely powerful concept and a very useful tool for programming. In this example, we have the same. A function, in this case called hello function, and in this case we pass a parameter. We decide to call this parameter name, and then we reuse this parameter here. Remember the f string? So we have a placeholder here for name, and we print whenever is inside this variable name. So again, if I run this, nothing is going to happen because we are not calling the function. If I decide to call the function, and don't pass any parameters, we are going to get an error because this function was defined with one parameter to be passed. So Python is clever enough to understand that we need to pass a parameter, and it's going to warn us, it's going to return an error saying that that function is missing one required positional argument. So if we pass here an argument, for example, we pass a name, Peter, and now we run this function again, we can see here that it returns hello Peter, basically prints that on the screen. It's printing whenever we pass as a parameter to that function. So for example, if we do the same, hello function, and we pass another name, in this case, it's gonna, of course, execute both lines, so the first and the second. So it's gonna print Peter and Mary. So it's important here that we understand this concept of passing parameters. We can pass more than one parameter. For example, let's say that we want to pass name and surname. So we can put a comma and then surname. These are just variable names. So basically here you can literally use whenever you want. And here we can use hello name and put a space, for example, and surname. And that's a variable we can use in there. So if we make the same kind of call with a function and say Peter, then we're gonna get an error because, as before, here we have another parameter. There are two parameters and we are passing only one. So if we have, for example, Peter Smith, and we run this, then we have hello Peter Smith. Basically, the first parameter is going to be identified by position to the first parameter and the second to the second parameter. It's very important to keep the order precise here because these parameters are not named, which is something that we will see later in the future. But for now, think about the position of each parameter for the function to be extremely important. So when you call the function, you have to make sure that whatever data you're passing matches the position of the parameters that you are interested to use. As we saw already before, there are many functions that we have been already using without realizing it. For example, the function type, we can pass something and it's going to return this one is an integer. And the function print that we know, and we pass anything and it's going to print. As you can see, they all have this format, a name, a parenthesis, and then parameters that we pass inside. All these are functions. These functions are already provided by Python by default, but we can define our own, or we can also import modules, software and code that somebody else wrote into our own and call those functions as well, something that we will learn in the future. So now let's talk about what is the meaning of returning a value that we heard so many times. This function returns this. This is a common terminology, like we learned before, like defining a function, calling a function, or this function returns this or that. So for example, in this case, I'm going to create a function called 1. And in this function, I return the number 1. That's all it does. Again, if we run this, nothing is going to happen. But if I call the function 1 inside this code, nothing is going to happen again. Because this function, what it does is just returns something. It's not actually calling a function to print something on the screen. It's doing an action. It's just returning a value. So the way you have to imagine this is as whenever here is after the return, in this case, the number 1, is going to be replaced in this part here where you call the function. So all these 1 and double parentheses is going to be completely replaced. And in that same position, a 1 will be there. Internally, that's what it happens. It replaces that place where you call the function to whenever that function returns. Based on that, for example, if I do print 1 and we call, in this case, we call the function 1 here, and whenever 1 returns, it's going to be replaced here where 1 is, and that will be the parameter to the function print. When we execute this, we have the print is printing 1. And so this is the part that you need a little bit to wrap your head around, like we are calling a function which returns something. Basically, that part is going to be replaced, but whenever value is returned, and that value, it can be the parameter for another function, in this case, print. Now let's say that we want to make this function a little bit more complicated. So we call it like add 1. And what we do here, we pass a value. And to whenever value we pass, we add 1 to that value. So we have to change here the name, add 1, and if I pass 1 as a parameter, what is going to happen here, okay, I'm going to put a space here that is not necessary for you a little bit to just to see visually how the positioning works. So this add 1 is passing 1 parameter, which is the number 1. This parameter is going to be in the variable value, and this is going to be in this return statement replace here. So this value is going to be replaced by whenever we pass, in this case 1, and is going to be added 1. And that result, which is going to be 1 plus 1, 2, is what the function is going to finally return to us. So all this part here is going to be replaced by this result. Whenever the execution of this part results is going to be returned here. This part is going to be replaced. So if we run this, we get an error. And yeah, because I added one more D in add, maybe you spotted before, I didn't now. Okay, now if we run this again, we can see 2. So as we said before, this 1 is passed here, is replaced, 1 plus 1, and then we have 2. We can pass any other number, like 42, for example. If we run it, it's going to be 43. So we can see an example here of what it means to have a function that receives a value, executes some operation on it, and returns a value. That's the concept of returning something. As you can see, the basic concept of a function is quite simple, but we will see in the future how these can be evolved into more complex kinds of functions. We will have anonymous functions. We can pass a function as a parameter to another function. We can do a lot of things with them, and they're extremely powerful. In the next episode, we're going to learn about classes. This is extremely important for object-oriented programming. Probably you already heard about it somewhere. You will see how functions play an important role in object-oriented programming, and everything we learned so far is going to be applied in the next lesson. So remember to subscribe, stay tuned, and see you soon. Thank you for watching.